David has a bachelor's degree in biology with a concentration in ecology, evolution, and behavior. His education background informs his research and his perspective on alien anatomy and biology. In 1997, the national television program Strange Universe featured a segment on his research. His artwork has also been seen in Fate magazine, Open Minds magazine, both terrific publications by the way, and numerous other publications as well as over the internet. And it is my distinct pleasure to present Mr. David Chace.
What do aliens look like? That's a question basically since, 87, when I realized that it's more than just one type of alien that people are seeing. In fact, there are several types of aliens that are described, but in the late 80s, I became really interested in trying to answer that question of what are all the different types and what do they look like. In 1991, I met a woman named Garnett Doonan at a group, UFO Contact Center International, run by Eileen Garut, that was meeting in Federal Way, Washington. And Garnett was the first experiencer that I met, and I can also call her a contactee and an abductee as well. By the way, the names I'll be using, most of them are real names, some pseudonyms possibly, just depending on the understandings and permissions I have with each individual. So basically my approach was, I realized that after meeting Garnett that I can actually meet people who've seen aliens and talk to them. And so since I like drawing, that was a good start. Straightforward approach. All right, so I do learn I need to distinguish between beliefs and experiences and focus on the experiences. Just the facts, please. In particular, if I can talk to someone and have them focus on a particular event, this particular encounter experience. For instance, if they saw a gray standing at the end of their hall and they saw it from a particular angle, then I can have a distinct visual memory to focus on rather than them just telling me, oh, this is what it looks like, without a context. So ask people to describe their experiences, ask about the context, when, where, what was going on in their life, and then all the details of each experience, and ask clarifying questions, because in written communication, in spoken communication, and in drawing, any of those by itself has limitations, and there's always a need for clarifying questions and getting more information. How do I know this information I'm presenting to you is accurate? I don't. There are many possible sources of error. Conscious recall and hypnotic recall both have their problems. The aliens do seem to love using screen images, which are images projected into the mind in real time or somehow otherwise created. Screen memories, images people are left with after the fact, like a false memory that covers an event to disguise their appearance and cause confusion about exactly what happened. So I've learned to kind of chill out, get used to uncertainty, get used to not knowing, and put your faith in the future. I put my faith in the future that there is a time still to come when science will have all these answers. And in the meantime, just enjoy the ride. Dan Wright, longtime member of MUFON, an investigator. In 1995, he was doing the MUFON Abduction Transcription Project. This was a quote, multiple groups of entities have been routinely intruding into the lives of Americans, children as well as adults, roommates and married couples alike, and sometimes whole families. A single group typically consists of a few or several entity types or species with differing looks and roles. So I think there's more than just one group with one agenda. I think there are multiple groups, but different species that you do see again and again. In 1995, I also self-published a booklet of the illustrations I'd done over the period from basically 91 to 95, right up before publishing this. And it was called A Visual Guide to Alien Beings. And this is the cover image I created for it at the time using colored pencils and ink and so forth. Nowadays I do use Photoshop for that stuff. It's no longer in print, but if you would like to see a lot of the artwork that was featured in it, you can find those online at my online sketchbook, The Hades, Reptoids, and Aliens. And in about 2010, Kim Carlsberg wrote a book compiling a bunch of different illustrations. Kim Carlsberg is an experiencer from California. Her book was called The Art of Close Encounters. So for that, I did a revised digital edition of the Galactic Family Portrait, as I call it. And I had to add in one of the praying mantis type aliens because I didn't have them in the original drawing. So here's a close-up kind of showing the different types together based on the descriptions of the witnesses. These are some of the different kinds of alien hands that have been described. Startlia is a tall female being that Garnet Doonan described to me. She has a hand that has four long, kind of tubular fingers with a little pad at each tip and no thumb. But apparently she can bend her fingers in such a way that she doesn't actually need a thumb. Of course, there's reptilian claws. There's the hand with 4 digits from the Allagash case. And various other kinds of hands that have been described. So what are the most common types or categories of UFO occupants? They're Greys, Reptilians, Nordics, and Insectoids. Insectoids typically praying mantis-like. Hybrids, also fairly common. I don't consider really a primary type because they're more of a derived mix of features from 2 or more different types. And very often people talk about a gray human hybrid. So why these 4 types? I don't know. That's an excellent question, though. And some biological concepts may be relevant to that question as well as the rest of my presentation. Convergent evolution, which is basically creatures from different ancestors evolving to get to a similar final end product, like dolphins and ichthyosaurs. Even though one's a reptile, one's mammal, they both came to a same shape because of the niche they occupy. Neoteny and heterochrony are changes in the timing of, changes in the genes that control the timing of development. That might explain why some aliens, for instance Greys, resemble humans with more fetal-like proportions instead of like what we think of as an adult human. Homologous and non-homologous anatomical structures. An example of homologous is the arm of a human being and the wing of a bird are both derived ancestrally from the same structure. Non-homologous would be different parts of the body, different structures. Genetic engineering and transgenesis, or basically manipulating genes, combining genes from different species, what in this phenomenon we sometimes refer to as hybridization or crossbreeding. Those are obviously very important in determining what forms of beings we see because they don't just let nature take its course. They like to get involved in what their forms are. That's something that they're very seems coming up again and again in many cases. And then, of course, there's stuff we don't know, like morphic resonance, which is a theory Rupert Sheldrake proposed, and other dimensions, and whether what's going on in the astral plane, for instance, could have something to do with the physical forms of living things. And of course, not all aliens fall into those 4 categories. There's also little stocky beings, sometimes blue in color, sometimes darker, like even shiny black I've heard described. They tend to have lots of furrows in the skin, kind of a wide nose, and fuller lips than most of the other types. And there's close-up. Often they wear little monk's robes. This is a Startlia, the female being seen by Garnet Doonan back in the 90s, late 80s through late 90s. Startlia was routinely visiting Garnet and her family. of Startlia would come through a portal in the air, right? So you couldn't even see the portal. It would just be pastel-colored light, little sparkles that would disappear, and then Startlia would step through, just like floating out from a crack in the fabric of the air itself. And Startlia never walked on the ground. She always hovered a few inches above the ground. And she glowed from within. So she's what some people would call a light being rather than another type, but she does kind of resemble a gray or a hybrid with a very elongated face. Startlia was always accompanied by a small whitish being named Dahami, and Dahami was kind of like her bodyguard. Whereas Startlia emanated a feeling of unconditional love, Dahami was just very kind of stern and serious all the time. And Garnett didn't really like the feeling she got from Dahami, but she understands the necessity of him in the visitations. There's another being, Dahami also glows from within his body, but not as brightly as a Startlia. And by the way, I do think that's something that, for lack of a better word, we have to call paranormal. The source of this light, it has something to do with the nature of light and information in other dimensions. And I say that based on information that was given to some experiencers. The other being is what I call a football head, and a group of these football head beings visited a friend of mine who's a UFO investigator back in 1995 in February. February 9th, 1995. The leader was about 5 feet tall. He had this triangular patch with a circle with a triangle inside that, which happens to be the same symbol that Dahami wears. So I did this lineup to show some similarities between these different beings. Of course, one of them is the famous Quasga, who is the leader of the beings from the Andresen affair, which is a famous book by Raymond Fowler on Betty Luca's experiences. The visitation to my UFO investigator friend in 1995 involved a UFO sighting that happened the previous day that she didn't know about. She'd gone to bed and then had this aliens entered into her dream. She was dreaming she was going out to investigate a UFO sighting, and then the aliens stopped her car and pulled her out, and they were like telling her not to investigate it. Then she woke up out of the dream, and the aliens were physically in the room, standing around her bed, telling her, don't investigate this UFO sighting. And she basically was telling them to disengage themselves. And they did, apparently they disappeared and left, but they did something to her that heated her body up, and her skin was all red the next morning. And she didn't even know that this sighting had been reported, because her husband had received the call from the National UFO Reporting Center after she had gone to bed. The following weekend, of course, not wanting to pay attention to what aliens necessarily tell us, a group of us from our local MUFON group did go out to investigate the sightings. It involved 3 or 4 alien craft, as well as several planes and helicopters, indicating a possible military involvement. But we did abort the investigation because we didn't have the cooperation of all the witnesses, and some of the people involved were minors. Small being also implanted an image, was manipulating someone's dreams, standing actually on her bed, and the woman woke up, and this being jumped back, kind of surprised. More details of this being, again, not fitting into any of those 4 basic types I listed earlier. This one was, brown skin, very ancient, and felt familiar somehow, as if the woman knew this being from before. Another example of a hybrid type, a couple different ones that were seen by a gentleman aboard a craft. Same gentleman described this female pilot who had vertical slit pupils, but otherwise pretty much human-like. The pupils actually had color to them, like orange. Gentleman also saw these beings on a beach when he was in the military. This was a beach in Panama in 1965. He was with a group of soldiers. They saw this craft land. Then all the soldiers were paralyzed. Out immediately, you didn't see the beings exit the craft. They just appeared beside the craft, approached them, walked amongst the soldiers, and walked back and disappeared, and the craft took off and the soldiers could move again. Close up of the being with some color. He had a jewel on his collar and his patch, and that's what the symbol on the patch looked like, or the insignia. Another gentleman was an Army security guard working at, doing a detail with a National Security Agency base in 1969. He saw this small being in the base. When the being was brought into the room, they had to dim the lights because the eyes were very sensitive to the light. And again, close-up of this being, very pale skin with just a touch of pink to it, kind of a blue-gray iris, and the eyes, obviously he couldn't be out in our sunlight. He might have come from a world with less sunlight or from an underground situation. That's the insignia the army man who saw the being used to wear. This is a being named Urani, a female being whose race was apparently in trouble for lack of their sexuality was falling behind, and they were studying humans to try to relearn sexual reproduction and the emotions involved, so that their population was at risk of becoming too underpopulated. And this is all the contact notes. It did involve a man being lifted up into a craft, and he had an experience being taken to another world. The experience seemed to last a week. He was returned the same night. So there was a time anomaly there. He woke up the next morning in bed, didn't remember getting into the house, and he was dressed in his clothes and shoes. So they didn't bother to undress him or anything, or change into his pajamas. And a few days after the event, he got really sick and had to go to the hospital because of some after effects, but he was fine at the time. And this is a being seen aboard a craft in Arkansas in 1991. This is a being seen at a military base in 1995, kind of resembling a hybrid. This being was in charge of human military on this base in the American Southwest during what appeared to be a mass abduction. A woman and someone she worked with that she knew were both there. A brown being with wrinkled skin resembles a gray. This art is actually by a gentleman from the UK named Martin. This is kind of his familiar being. What is a gray? Gray is a standard UFO occupant or alien humanoid with physical characteristics such as a large head and cranium, large eyes, typically slanted or teardrop shaped, a small thin body, typically 3 to 5 feet in height, gray to ash white skin color. There are innumerable variations with different builds, types of hands, eyes, skin textures and colors, body sizes, etc. But they all look like grays, so we call them grays. Unfortunately for definitions, that's all we can do now is give it a loose definition. A couple examples. Another gray with like a silver jumpsuit. This is another drawing by Martin showing a gray crouched on a house, and what his memory was the owl. The image that he came up with later was a gray. Another drawing by Martin showing the gray and what David Jacobs, the researcher, calls an incubatorium. Martin on a table. He says, "Don't ask what they're about to do with this wand." My interpretation of the being on the cover of Communion, I made the cranium a little bit larger and reduced the lips to fit closer with Whitley Strieber's description. Although I do love the original image by Ted Jacobs, which Ted Jacobs' image certainly reached a lot of people back in '87 and continues to. Small being seen on a boat in Dutch Harbor, Alaska in 1991.
Can I get you anything?
Boat actually off of Dutch Harbor, Alaska at sea. The man heard a voice in his head sounding like a child's voice. Turn around and look at me. He was crouched in a room on board the boat stacking some boxes. He turned around For a few seconds, he saw this being standing there with a very mean look on his face, and the being disappeared. He took that as a warning to stop talking about his UFO sightings. Another gray with kind of a stern look just because of the ridge of bone above its eyes. Another gray seen in Thailand in 1987. More details on the one from Thailand. The gentleman had a conscious memory of communist soldiers coming into the room. Later on, he realized that wasn't right. He went under hypnosis and then remembered, oh, it was great. This is, there was a woman, she had an experience involving, she was running late for work. It was early morning, but she knew she had to be at work at a certain time. She went out, she was heading out to her car, but she turned around to go back to double check, make sure the door was locked, because she doesn't usually do that. And behind her, a few feet back there, she saw a little gray. Initially, I drew it with the white, just based on her description. Then she went with me to do more details, and it was actually bluish with the larger eyes. And its mouth was open like, ooh, I've been discovered. And it was hovering just like a couple inches above the ground. It quickly turned and like zoomed into the bushes. But she was startled, and it was a disturbing experience for her because she hadn't consciously remembered seeing grays for like over a decade before that. Incidentally, after that experience, she got to work. She knew from the clocks in the house that she was running late. When she got to the parking lot, there were no cars, and she thought that was strange because there should be some more cars. And then she asked the woman in the cafeteria, well, why aren't you open yet? And the woman said it's only 6:30, and it should have been at least 6:50 or 7 o'clock. So we call that game time, where she went apparently backwards in time, because it had been like 6:30 when she left the home, and it takes at least 20 minutes to do the drive. So there was a situation there with a time manipulation. Another being, whitish skin, large cranium, smaller eyes, more details. These are attempts to do the little stick pin figure on his collar. More examples of grays in the hybrid. Same woman who described the previous slide remembers at age 7 seeing a large reptilian being in like San Jose, California, climbing into one of those like drainage canals. This is a drawing by Josie Gallant, who's an experiencer, and a researcher, and an artist, showing a small drone-type being. And this being seemed to move by popping forward, skipping over gaps of time, or however that happened. Another being seen by another woman who moved by like blinking in and out, like teleporting really short distances really quickly in rapid succession. And that's either the person's consciousness is being affected, the way they see it, or the being is manipulating time or space or something. This is a drawing of the same effect by Ken Bakeman, who's an experiencer and an artist. What is a reptilian? A UFO occupant or a cryptid with reptilian features such as scales, lizard-like snout or muzzle, claws or talons, well-defined musculature and bone structure, yellow iris, and vertical slit pupils. Of course, those are just some of the features. There's variations, different kinds of scales. Sometimes the iris is red, sometimes the iris can change color, but this is kind of a typical set of features. Prominent reptilian researchers in ufology. These are people who, particularly back in the 80s, when Barbara Bartolek got onto the subject of reptilians, she was followed up by Carla Turner and John Carpenter, Linda Moulton Howe, John Rhodes, who calls them Reptoids, Dr. Joe Lewell, John Mack, and Barbara Lamb, all have spoken publicly and done research into cases involving reptilians. Some non-ufological approaches to the study of reptilian humanoids: cryptozoology, ancient literature and archaeology, and conspiracy theories. These are all different ways people have gone about investigating experiences with reptilians, because there are reptilians showing up like the lizard man in South Carolina. That was more of a cryptozoological phenomenon, and then people look for the evidence of that in ancient literature about snake beings and so forth. Reptilian contact is not a conspiracy, it is an experience. I want to make that point clear. People are having experiences involving contact, either physical, telepathic, astral, with reptilian humanoids. Cat-eyed grays is kind of a gray reptilian hybrid. The main point I want to get across with this image is the sclera is the white part of the eye. The yellow iris is the muscular portion that expands and contracts to enable the black pupil in the center to open or close to let in more or less light. That's an important detail when you're drawing these beings, that people know what terminology you're using when you're asking about details of the eyes. These little beings were also capable of passing through solid glass and materializing or dematerializing, but they were physical and also left scratch marks on the man's body. So this phenomenon crosses over. These are physical beings, it seems, but with paranormal abilities. Another close-up showing some of the features of the being. Here again is a close-up. This was, I did an acrylic painting, then took it into Photoshop and cleaned it up a little. This is an actual reptile that exists on Earth. This is an alligator lizard I found in Carmel Valley, California. Also in California in Carmel Valley, I found this baby rattlesnake sitting under a rock. Just to remind you what reptiles look like and why people call these beings reptilians. One of the first cases I had was this being, the woman described very thick tendons or cords going down the throat. I found that's a very common feature in subsequent cases. She also described bead-like scales under the rim of the eye and around the lips, or what would be lips, and under the nostrils. Typically, those locations will have different coloration of the scales. And more drawings or acrylic paintings of the same being. He also had these slits between his eyes and nostrils. Another close-up showing his chest was covered by what she described as resembling a turtle shell. Another reptilian being wearing a hood. My revised version of that being. And there they are as they fit into the galactic family portrait. First acrylic painting I ever did of a reptilian back in '95. Examples, most reptilians seem to have a ridge down the center of the forehead, some have more of a crease, some just have different sorts of scales. Often the colors on the face will be lighter than the back of the head, for example. This is a drawing by an actual witness who saw this being while he was in the military. What he was doing in the military, I don't know. I never met this man. The drawing was passed to me with my mutual friend. And this is my interpretation of it. It's kind of what Barbara Lamb refers to as a lightning strike pupil, because Barbara Lamb saw a being also with the same kind of pupil. Barbara Lamb's a researcher, but after she started working with reptilian experiencers, one showed himself to her in her living room, held her hands, and she only felt positive, warm, loving feelings from that. The message from him was, I just wanted to know that, he wanted you to know that we're real, to help you as you're working with these people. And this is not an exact interpretation. I've worked with Barbara Lamb. Some I couldn't get exact. It had different colors, darker colors. This is, Debbie Tripp mentioned Misha Johnston, who runs a support group. From the early 90s at least, and going back earlier than that, she's had a relationship with a reptilian male named Ayano. And this is an interpretation of Ayano based on Misha's description. This is a revised interpretation. The face should be a little longer, as you can see here. Another man who has seen Ayano, the vision through his third eye, described him more like this. This is what Ayano's body looks like. He has 3 fingers and a thumb with some webbing out to the first knuckle and some kind of armor across the chest. It's a natural part of his body, and he wears a belt. This is Iona's a warrior. He's very friendly and loving, but he is with a group of reptilians that is in conflict with another group of reptilians that told Misha, they were telepathically, they told Misha we were called the Chikara. So this is a Chikara. This is Misha Johnston and Melinda Leslie back in the late 90s were working on together on a website called militaryabductions.com, relating to people's experiences with what today we've come to know as MyLabs, but apparently covert human operations, the human factor involved in alien abduction, following up on what the aliens are doing. In the year 2000, they were both staying together in Misha's apartments in Southern California. They were taken from the apartment in the middle of the night to a military base, which we assume is possibly Camp Pendleton, possibly Miramar, somewhere in that region. On the military base, they each were taken to an underground room, and they encountered a reptilian humanoid who threatened them by implanting a virtual reality scenario into their minds. They were instructed to discontinue work basically on the book about the military abductions that they were working on. So for several after that, Misha Johnston got out of the abduction research for several years because not just that experience, but subsequent experiences with someone trying to run her off the road and someone threatening her in a bar and other things. But she did come back into it, and she now runs the online support group. It did affect Melinda as well, even though the following morning after that abduction, apart from a broken coffee table and the broken door lock, they didn't remember very clearly what had happened. But if you want to know the details of the case, the person to talk to is Melinda Leslie, because she has a fantastic memory. Misha's memory is not as sharp, and what's intriguing is they have different recollection of what the reptilian looked like. Misha, I talked to her in April of 2012, and she gave me this description of a massive gold-colored reptilian with spines on his jowls, a long tail, and red pupils that when he became angry, the pupils expanded, like dilated. And of course, big teeth. And this is a close-up of the being as described by Misha in 2012. Later that year, I talked to Melinda Leslie. She described him as a green lizard man. She didn't notice the teeth so much because he only opened the mouth when he was kind of breathing heavily, hissing, humming, in order to induce the virtual reality vision in her mind of the threats, the mutilation that was meant to scare her. But so they have their very different descriptions, although the general features as far as the bone structure and stuff is similar. Kind of one theory we're exploring is that maybe since Misha was already very familiar with reptilians and had a very friendly relationship with this reptilian named Ayano, that the being disguised his appearance as something more glorious and intimidating in order to scare Misha, whereas a simple reptilian might be sufficient to scare Melinda. We don't know. And from a profile, this is approximately what the being that Melinda saw would have looked like. Another reptilian just showing some of them have these wide ventral scales on the chest, and in some cases those ventral scales seem to go all the way up to the throat, although it seems to be more common that they stop at the clavicle, whereas the scales on the throat would then be smaller. This is a reptilian foot. It had 3 toes in the front with pronounced tendons, and a toe in the back of the foot right above the ankle with a little claw. Examples of different types of reptilian hands. A 5-fingered hand seems to be fairly common. Digits ranged like a human. There's a reptilian named Captain, that's his nickname, who has a hand like this, webbing out to the first knuckle. Another example would be the 3 fingers with, and a thumb. And that's the sort of hand we believe Ayano has based on Misha's recollections. The webbing on Ayano, however, only extends to the first knuckle, and I've drawn it going out to the second knuckle there. This is a situation, a reptilian named Ruby is what we know her as. It's a female reptilian from a gentleman, a hypnotherapist, who was doing a regression on someone back in the early 90s. The woman who was regressing apparently was involved with some group of reptilians. During the regression, a reptilian materialized, and she was wearing this hooded robe, and the therapist asked her, "Are you a master teacher?" And she said in a deep, gravelly voice, which I believe she spoke out loud rather than telepathically, as he recalled it, "You may address me as such." And he said, "Are you of the light, Christ light?" And she just remained silent at that point. And then she was standing like this, covered in the monk's robe throughout that period, so he didn't see the reptilian features. Then she became angry. She pulled back her hood, pulled open the robe, and he could see that she was actually this very muscular reptilian being. Red pupils described that expanded as she became angry, just as Misha described, even though Misha's description conflicted with Melinda's of that reptilian in their situation. Ruby had on one breast to this symbol, triskelion, triangle, circle. This is a reptilian named Renjek, as drawn by Ken Bakeman. Renjek is kind of Ken Bakeman's main partner. Renjek and his craft, more drawings by Ken Bakeman. This is my interpretation of Renjek, although Ken did say the snout was a little bit longer than this. Notice he has just large leathery scales on the top of his head. Ken Bakeman's drawing showing the backpack, which was a power source that Renjek would use, with this wand, which could paralyze people at a distance. Another reptilian encountered by Ken Bakeman as he drew. And I want to say there is no shame in loving a reptilian. Many of the reptilian encounters, although I talked about some negative encounters there, many people have had very positive encounters with reptilians. People are in relationships with reptilians. Sometimes it's a sexual relationship, sometimes it's more just like a teacher or a guardian. And if you feel love for them, that's okay. Pamela Stonebrook, an abductee who was pretty well known in the late 90s. This is a drawing of her reptilian done by Kisara. Kisara drew this, I believe, back in 1994, and it's been seen all over the internet throughout the late 90s. If you Googled reptilian, this is probably what you would see. Pamela remembers waking up in the middle of the night, in the middle of having sex with a very handsome blonde man who she didn't know. She didn't remember bringing him home with her, but she thought the experience was a pleasant one, and so she went with it, and then he transformed into a reptilian. She got scared, but she began to pull herself out of fear because the communication from him telepathically was very loving. And then he disappeared as if just whisked away into another dimension. And he came back on a couple other occasions, and his last message to her during, I believe, the third encounter was, never be afraid of anything. And she has actually, this is my interpretation of Pamela's reptilian, and she has actually learned out-of-body travel and has targeted him in the astral and has actually gone to him rather than just waiting for him to come to her. This is another friendly, compassionate reptilian in the hood. This is a reptilian who is a guardian. This is, there's a woman, a close friend of mine named Bridget, who has encountered this reptilian back in the early 90s, this reptilian named Captain, who was just a scientist, spoke to her telepathically. After regression, she remembered him actually having the wide horizontal ventral scales across his chest, so I probably need to revise this illustration. His iris color could change from like a red-orange, kind of a fiery red-orange, to a gold-yellow color. This is another image of Captain. He has another name, Insectoids, and that's just the first 4 syllables because there was more to it that Bridget couldn't really recall. But she settled on Captain because that was easier. And he seemed to be in charge of the crew on the ship. And he had this black uniform that the other members of the crew, which included grays and some other types, used the same. And on the shoulder was a symbol somewhat like this. This is a more revised version of the symbol. Another reptilian with a tail that Bridget saw. This one was green. It came in through her wall. It was moving, leaving kind of a warp trail behind it, moving very snake-like as it came up to her. It put its arms down by its side. The arms morphed into the body, and it turned into kind of a giant snake. Bridget then was whisked away from that experience by Captain. So this being might have been threatening or something, but if so, Captain got her out of that situation. Garnet Doonan has seen reptilians at an underground base and on a space colony she visited, and this is kind of how they lived, how they looked. The darker one is actually the more accurate, but it doesn't show up quite as well. It had flecks, little dark flecks in this iris. Again, the same one, we call it Vectra because of something Startlia told to Garnet, but he had a big, solid piece of a scale or plate covering his chest as a natural armor. Tells you something maybe about their ancestry. This is a drawing by Ken Bakeman showing 2 different reptilians he saw, one of which was white, had these flaps of skin under its arms. People talk about, are these Draco reptilians that have wings? I have not gotten consistent descriptions of wings, but there are people who have seen something suggesting that some of the reptilians do have wings. This is a symbol that the being wore. This one was seen by Simon Parkes. We call this being the White King. Simon Parkes, pretty famous contactee from the UK. This one had something like vestigial wings, but they were actually these rods covered in flesh that could make a kind of a rustling, sound like rustling leaves when you flap them. This is another reptilian. This guy was a shapeshifter in the sense that he would come to this woman on different occasions, and each time he would look like something different, and he would try to pretend to be other beings or people she knew. But in one case he was white with these horns. Another reptilian in profile. There are many that are white. Another white reptilian didn't have any noticeable scales. This one from one of Josie Gallant's illustrations from one of her dreams. A very vivid dream, though, in which there was some communication, and I suspect it was more than a dream. Same one. A reptilian named Zatar contacted a woman through when she was meditating. More drawings of Zatar and others of his crew in their biological laboratory on board the ship, and more details of Zatar and a pendant that he wore. And an example of a kind of a reptilian gray crossbreed with features of both reptilians and grays, and another example of such a being. Drawing by Martin of a smaller reptilian species he's seen. These guys, I believe, are only about 4 feet tall, or maybe a little shorter. Not much webbing, just a hint of webbing between the fingers. Again, drawings by Martin of this being, and then that one in color. This one was a situation, it's probably too long for me to go into, but this was a rape that seemed to occur in a ritualistic fashion. The woman did have, it involved seeing giant snakes, came out of this forest, morphed into reptilian humanoids. 2 of them held her by her arms. One of them raped her. Then they left. She was running through the woods, and then she lost consciousness, woke up in her bed. her arms were sore, and there were physical after effects. The drawings were done by Josie Gallant, who was a researcher in this case. Another drawing of that being. This is a reptilian drawing by Josie Gallant. Jim Sparks encountered this type. Interesting thing about it is that its pupils actually have color or light in them. The forehead was very ridgy or bumpy. Josie's understanding is that this is actually brain augmentation, something they do to themselves. Another example of something like a reptilian, and the small beings that accompanied it. Erica Getch, a woman who's pretty well known in the experience community, in 1986, had an abduction with some of her friends. On board the craft, she saw this blue being who is a form of reptilian, although he doesn't have obvious scales like some of the others. The message she got from that experience, the main message, I guess, was get past the fear in order to get to the love. This is a drawing by Patricia Mays, an experiencer who's had lifelong telepathic contact with a reptilian-human hybrid. And again by Patricia Mays, showing a combination of mammalian and reptilian features. I guess I'll abbreviate the rest of my presentation. There is substantial evidence that humans are descended from indigenous primates on Earth, but there is a possibility that science can't rule out that there has been extraterrestrial intervention, for example, in our evolution. What is the Nordic? Nordic is UFO occupant, looks almost human, typically described as blonde hair, Northern European features, handsome physique. Many variations exist. Not all human-appearing UFO occupants look Nordic, however. A woman I know encountered one who looked like a very tall African American. Some look like Native Americans, so they have different features. Here's some of my drawings of Nordics. This is a painting by Josie Gallant of the Nordic that she has seen. Not all of them have blue eyes. Some of them have other colors like a golden hazel. Another drawing by Josie Gallant of a male Nordic and of a female Nordic. Nordics can be very tall, anywhere from 6 to 7 feet, even a little taller. This one is from one of Dr. Joe Lewell's cases. Had actually Native American features and tan skin. Some of them do have fairly tan skin, and some are very fair-skinned. But this one had blonde hair. Josie Gallant has seen Men in Black, very traditional Men in Black look. It was associated with a very telepathic kind of experience, so there was something not quite human about them. Another gentleman I know encountered a small, hairy anthropoid being. Other mammalian types have been described as bear-like. Some of these may actually be screen memories for other types. Here's some drawings by Josie Gallant showing the hybrid children. Many of us in this room probably have hybrid children from the program the Greys are involved with. This is the child a little bit older in profile. The Nordics, when their children, I know a woman who was taken to a nursery run by the Nordics, and those children had enlarged craniums, look very much like this. Doctor in charge of the hybridization program with Josie, and this was back when she was in the program a few decades ago. That's another image of that being. He called himself Quasga as well, just like the being from the Anderson case, but obviously he looked quite different. My interpretation of that being. A drawing of a gray by Josie Gallant. This is a hybrid being from a species called the Sasani that many of you may know from the channeling Daryl Anka channels a being named Bashar, who is one of the Sasani. And as a profile, Josie actually telepathically connected with one of the Sasani in order to do these drawings. What is an insectoid? I'll have to go really quickly on this section. Category of UFO occupants that resemble insects. They have large insect-like eyes and faces, thin limbs with prominent joints, hard body surface resembling a chitinous exoskeleton, and stiff or jerky movements. They typically are described as looking like praying mantis or various other insect-like beings. And I'll just go quickly through. This one's based on my interpretation of Josie's experience. These beings actually healed Josie of an intestinal malignancy back in the early 90s that she was at risk from. This was actually the first praying mantis type I encountered from an experiencer. Did these drawings around 1994. And this shows how its body can bend and so forth. This is similar to the type that Simon Parks is familiar with. These are drawings by Martin of the praying mantis type that he has seen. The mandibles can open up all the way. Very bony hands with very thin, long fingers. Dan Wright, just find the last two slides here. 5 themes in UFO abductions. Dan Wright did the MUFON Abduction Transcription Project from 92 to 97 or 98 when the project kind of ran out of steam. One of the very important themes in UFO abductions is the abductee's sense of having a connection with the UFO occupants, a connection seemingly born from a realm of existence outside of this conscious life as a human, possibly suggesting reincarnation, even multidimensional simultaneous existence, maybe even having an identity as one of the UFO occupants. And finally, my closing quote, to end on a positive note: fear not, worry not, you will become what you desire to be, for we see you as you are in our time, and in our time you are among the stars, and you know who you are, Bashar. Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for giving me a few extra minutes.